Introduce that the Armenian Studies program has just published a new book, and this is number 22 in the Armenian series at Fresno State, of which I've been the editor now for the past 15 years. And this is a book called Microhistories in Armenian Studies, and it's based on a conference that we held here in 2023 with my colleagues Dr. Umi Kurt and Ara Sarafian. And it's 5 articles about different aspects of Armenian history, and specifically around, some of it is around the genocide, but other parts are different parts. And microhistories means that it's a kind of a dive deep into one locality, rather than kind of giving you a broader history. Microhistories, in a very general sense, is that. And so this book has just been published, and if you're interested, we have a table full of some of our other books as well. And I'm just going to move over because we have some books that are really quite interesting. One of them that I like to talk about is Armenian Poetry of Our Time, which was the poetry book by Diana Derhovanesyan. And she passed away a few years ago, but she was probably the foremost Armenian-American poetess. She was based in Massachusetts, and she was a well-known poet in her own right, but then she also began to take Armenian poetry and working with other scholars in Armenian, translate to English, and then she put it into poetic fashion. So it's 120 plus poems from different periods in Armenian history, which make it quite interesting. So if you're interested afterwards, come on up, and Sosi is going to be here at the table, and we can take a look at those books. So today, it's hard to believe, is May 9th, so those of you that are not familiar with what's going on campus, this is already the last week of classes. So Wednesday was actually the last day of classes, and then Monday through Thursday of next week are our final examinations, and then Saturday is commencement or graduation. So there'll be a lot of exercises, commencement exercises in the Save Mart Center, because now it's indoors, thank goodness, right? Because it used to be out at the stadium and it was quite hot, but we're kind of moved it indoors in that. So tonight is going to be our final presentation in our lecture series, and as you know, we'll start up again in the fall. But we're very happy today to have as our speaker Dr. David Zakarian. Many of you have met him before, but he has just started teaching here at Fresno State in the fall, and he's the Hagen Isabel Berberian Professor of Armenian Studies at Fresno State, and he got his bachelor's degree and master's degree in English Language and Literature from Aristotle University in Thessaloniki. Sorry, my mouth is dry a little bit. And a Master of Studies in Classical Armenian and a DPhil from the University of Oxford. And as many of you know, he's spoken already here a couple of times at Fresno, in Fresno, about his research, which is really about the role of women in Armenian historiography. So in the writing of Armenian history, he brings out and draws out the role of women, because sometimes they are underrepresented, and since, I don't know, is it 99% or 100% of the writers, the manuscript writers, were Armenian? Males, I wanted to say. There are few females, but 95%. So it just tells you that the perspective then is going to be predominantly from the male perspective. But what he is doing is looking particularly at early Christian literature, and he gave a talk about the women in Armenian Christian literature. And tonight, we're very happy to have him speak on a topic of glimpses into women's lives in medieval Armenia, which will explore how Armenian historical sources offer some rare but valuable insights into the experience of women in the Middle Ages. So I'd like to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Dr. David Zakarian. Dr. Zakarian.
Thank you very much, Professor Park. Thank you very much for coming today, and it's a pleasure to see you all here. I want to start in a different way. So rather than starting to talk about the topic I want to present today, I want to ask you a question, but don't answer, just think about it. I want you to think about historical figures about whom you learned in school. Just think about it. A couple of names. Some names, famous people that you remember from your school years. It could be your Armenian school, American school, Lebanese school, wherever you went to school. Just try to think about 1 or 2 names. As I said, you don't need to say it. Now, I want you to tell me, how many women did you think of? Okay, we have 1 hand, 2, yes? Any names? Can you please just name?
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks, yeah. Sadly not Armenian. Yeah. So this is a problem. Sorry? Say. Yeah, but what, did you learn about her in school?
Yes, of course.
That's amazing. You went to a very good school, because in general this is not the case. Well, that is the problem that we face. One of the problems. There are many problems, but one of the problems that we face in our societies. It doesn't matter where we live. That very often we do not hear about women. We do not learn about women, and we do not get female figures that younger generations can identify with. And there is one answer to this problem. Why do we have this? And it's the ubiquitous patriarchy. So this is the problem that I decided to deal with as far as the Armenian history and Armenian sources are concerned. So if we look at the definition provided by Oxford Dictionary, I mean, you all know what it is about, but I want today us to focus on this description, that it is a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. So this is about power, but I also want to add to this, women are also excluded from having their own voice. They were excluded. Today things are changing, things are getting much better, but we're still not there. If you think about the Armenian school, so I had children who went to the Armenian school, and primarily they learn, of course, about Tigran the Great, about Armenian empires. They learn about Vargan Mamikonian. Sometimes they speak about Garagin Nezhde, but we have very few women that are presented in the textbooks and in the discourse that they teach at school. So my approach to this is that we need to speak about these women. There are lots of women that contributed greatly to our society, and this is something that everyone knows, but no one speaks about. And we need to put this in our school curriculum. We need to present these famous figures and try to instill also in girls these ideas about how they are part of this community. They can't be silenced. Their voice should be heard as well. For example, about Zabel Yesayan, I'm coming from a family of teachers, and my grandparents were teachers of Armenian literature and language and literature. I have never heard about Zabel Yesayan until like 10 years ago. And this is a shame, because it wasn't part of the school curriculum, not at least in Armenia, in the Republic of Armenia. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak about some relatively, well, I would say, obscure figures in Armenian history, but women who contributed in one way or another. Today I'm going to present some research that I have done recently, and hopefully by the end of this talk you will have some idea, like glimpses. That's why I put the word glimpses. We won't be able to understand everything, but glimpses into marriage, into financial dependence or independence, and on a few things about education of girls and women in medieval Armenia. So one of the sources that I use a lot in my current research are the so-called colophons. Those of you who attended the AGBU talk on colophons, which I gave, I explained it in more detail. I'm not going to do that today, but I want to point out a few things. So the colophons are texts, usually written at the added to the end of manuscripts. So the Armenian manuscripts have, unless it is damaged, they definitely have a colophon. And the colophon is an integral part of a manuscript, a very important one, by the way. It is usually added at the end of a manuscript. It usually starts with the word park, that is glory, and you could see that the letter P is highlighted. And the text that is included here is basically whatever the scribe wanted to write here. So this can be in a gospel manuscript, it can be a collection of religious texts, anything, but at the end, definitely you will find a colophon. And the colophon tells us about the manuscript itself, about who sponsored, who paid the money for the manuscript to be produced, who was the scribe, and sometimes they, and which is my favorite part, they tell some stories about the production of the manuscript, about the conditions under which they worked and it was created. And very often in these stories, you hear about women. Sometimes these stories are written by women. So when we have a female scribe, they would write also themselves, and they will tell their own stories. And usually this part is called, in Armenian the word is hishatakaran, which means a place of memory, commemoration. So this is the part where they would commemorate people who passed away, people to whom the manuscript is dedicated, and they will ask the readers usually to pray, to ask for God's mercy. And the idea was that if you do something good, your name will be written here, and people would pray for you. And if people pray for you, then during on Judgment Day, God will remember your name and will forgive you your sins. So it had also practical side of it. And unlike what we have today, people in the medieval period really believed in the second coming of Christ, and they really lived with this idea that we need to do something good so that we have some chances of inheriting the kingdom of heaven. So these are the sources that I'm using currently, but today I will also include one or two historical texts plus some inscriptions from the walls of the churches. So the first story that I want to tell you today comes from the Gospel of Sassoon. So the Gospel itself, we don't have access to it. We don't know where it is. Most likely it was destroyed during the Armenian genocide. Approximately 20 years before the Armenian genocide, an Armenian priest, scholar, intellectual, ethnographer, Garagin Servanstian, wrote down the description of this manuscript, and we have the detailed description, the text of the colophon. And then because the story is really interesting, some other manuscripts copied the same text. So we have exactly the same text taken from Sassoon Gospel, and it is copied in different other sources. But unfortunately, the original is today lost. So what do we have, what kind of story we have here? So it is a colophon, as I said, and the colophon starts with the word glory. So you could see that there is glory to the Holy Trinity, and then there is a description about the reason why this manuscript was produced. So we find out that this manuscript is dedicated to a maid, Kata. It was a common name apparently in medieval Armenia. So it is dedicated to her, and there is this plea that the author makes, the scribe makes, that so this is dedicated in her name, and we hope that God will consider, that Christ will consider her as one of the wise and holy virgins. This is a reference to Matthew 25:1-13, the parable of 10 virgins, 5 of whom were wise when they came to wait for Christ's coming. They were well prepared, they had additional oil and so on, and the other 5 were not wise enough. And eventually, only 5 of them who were well prepared, who knew that Christ would come, and they did everything they could, they inherited the kingdom of heaven. So basically, this is the plea of the scribe. The scribe wants people to pray for her so that she's considered one of those wise, holy virgins. Then the colophon continues, so this is the standard way. I began, and with his mercy, that is God's mercy, completed this holy gospel. So there is a description that tells us that it happened during the reign of the Armenian Catholicos Nerses Shnorali, Nerses the Gracious, and it happened in Sassoon, where the Lord of Sassoon was called Vigen, and he was the son of Chorduanel, and the grandson of great and powerful brave Tornik. We get the date, so the date usually goes with according to the Armenian calendar, so you need to add 551 to get the date that we have today. And then we find out that the manuscript, the entire manuscript, was sponsored by, it was done by the order of the blessed Christ-loving Queen Melekset, Vigen's spouse. who is from the Artsruni family and from the line of Saint Vartan, the daughter of the great prince of Mok Mayak. So for you to kind of imagine what we're talking about, what kind of territory we're talking about. So this is where Sasun is. This is Lake Van. And approximately 120, 130 years before the manuscript was written, in this part, there was the kingdom of Vaspuragan. So the kings of Vaspuragan built the Ahtamar, the beautiful Ahtamar church. So this woman, Melekset, comes from that line, from the line of these lords of Artsruni. So she has some royal blood, according to the scribe. So she's referred to as Taguhi. The Armenian word that is used is Taguhi, so queen, which of course literally means someone who's wearing a crown, but at the same time it was used usually for the landlady of the household. So you have a clan, you have the head of the clan, and then his wife usually would be the Digin or the Taguhi of the household. Now, the next description is really interesting. So the patriarchal society has its own values, its own kind of standards, and according to those standards, a woman should be, and these are all the qualities that they believe to be the right ones for them. So spiritual virtue, holiness, modesty, humility, the purity of fasting, and the daily prayer. But what is very interesting is this one, which we will see later on as well with regard to another woman. So she was a decorator of churches and the protector of priests, the guardian of the holy and the widows, dressing the naked and feeding the hungry. In other words, so her role, being from this noble background, her role was to support the work of people, support the charity, support everything related to the church. And this comes from already 5th century. We have evidence that women were in charge of education of their children, and women were working closely with the clergy. So the clergy were the educated one, and it was the clergy who would normally educate the kids, and the mothers would oversee this. So in that sense, there was a close connection already from the beginning of Armenia's Christianization. Then the colophon continues, and there is a description of this connection between Melekset, the sponsor of the manuscript, and her husband Vigen. So, and the interesting bit here is that out of all the biblical references to marriage, the scribe decides to choose this one, where it says, "Wives, be subject to your husbands in everything as you are to the Lord. And husbands, love your wives as you do your own bodies." So this was kind of their attitude, the church's stance on the roles within the family. And this is repeated again. But I want you to keep in mind the fact that the person who's writing this is also a man, and he's also a religious person, a cleric, writing this. So this was done consciously, so he chose this particular passage from there. What we learn next is about their children. So in the medieval period, women had many children, and the main idea was, especially if you are a noble woman, if you come from a noble family, you needed to have many children because, first of all, they would die very young, so not all of them survived. And there was another issue with that they needed an heir. Definitely they needed someone, a male heir, who would carry on the line of the father. So we are talking once again about the patriarchal structure of the Armenian society. So here there is this description that they had lots of children, but many of them died quite young. Now, one of the children that survived was Kata, to whom this manuscript was dedicated. And she was the beloved daughter of, at least of Melekset, according to this description. And then again, her description is, first of all, we describe her as a beautiful virgin, greatly adorned with all the graciousness, and then that she was perfect in stature and beauty and moral probity. So it's all about the way that they stand in society. These are the qualities that they wanted women to possess. What happens next is, so this is why the colophons are fascinating. You have a story. You can learn about someone's life. Of course, it is mediated. Of course, it comes through the perspective of a priest, a male priest, who will who will write things that he believes are right about the marriage and everything else. But still, we can learn something about what they were doing in their lives. So what happens is the parents decide to give her into a marriage, into a royal marriage. And this was another very common thing, trying to build alliances with other noble families in the area. If you think about the Armenian history in the 12th century, we don't have an independent state in historical Armenia. We have one in Cilicia, but not in historical Armenia. And constantly these territories are attacked by the Turkic tribes that live around. So they need to build these alliances to be able to survive. And so this was one of the mechanisms. So the girl, Kata, is, I don't think she has any choice according to this description. So the parents decided, and she was to marry someone called Shahin Shah, who was the grandson, the son of Grigor, grandson of Katakalos, son of Kamen the Great. So Grigor, this is kind of an Armenian name, but then we have Katakalos and Kamen, which are Greek names, so there must be some connection with the Greeks. This family had some connections with them. And again, there is this description that when she married, she displayed her beautiful graciousness, devoutness, compassion, guardianship of churches and priests. So we come again to this guardianship of churches and priests. So a woman taking charge of how the churches in the area were functioning. So she gave birth, very quickly she gave birth to one boy, Shah Melek. So they had already an heir here. So I think until recently, and maybe even today in some Armenian villages, arranged marriages are a common thing. When the couple don't see each other and they only meet before the wedding, or a couple of days before the wedding. And you might think that this was kind of the problem with the girls, but it turns out that Kata's brother was again sort of pushed into a marriage without wanting this too much. So again, the family sat down, having held a council, they decided that Chorduanel is going to marry the daughter of Vasil, the brother of the Armenian Catholicos Grigorios, the mighty and the great, whose name is Vanine, so the girl's name. So it was basically that the parents decided that their children need to marry strategically, so that they can keep the line, the noble line, but also be able to protect themselves in this very volatile situation. So if we once again look at the map, so this is where Sasun, once again, and Kata was married to approximately here. So there is a big distance here in between these two places. But they try to kind of create some sort of alliance here. This would matter because very soon a tragedy will happen, and because of the distance and because it was quite dangerous, the parents were not able to travel from Sasun to this area. So what we learn about Kata next? We learn that, and this is again a description of her marriage, that she was in joy and greatness. I mean, how do you know? But in any case, this is how the scribe presents it. And says that her Lord Shahin Shah was desirable. So this is something that they needed to present to the public. Again, notice that we don't hear any female voices here. It's all men talking about women here. And then we have the tragedy that happened. So apparently Kata was pregnant with twins. And during the childbirth, she died. So it says that in the process of removing the babies, the agony of death arrived. She died, but the children survived, apparently. So, and this was a big tragedy. As I said, the family heard about this, but they didn't manage to travel to come and say their goodbyes here. And when they found out, the mother, Melekset, decided that she needs to sponsor this manuscript. So she would sponsor the manuscript, as it says here. She bought this with money and received eternal greatness, and it remained as a memorial in the place of her daughter, as if they saw her alive when they saw it and read from it. So the manuscript was kept in the same place where she was married to her husband. So there was the church of Surperkic, the Holy Savior, and she was buried also there. And sponsoring the manuscript literally meant that it was a memorial for her. And the colophon says that if you hold this manuscript in your hands, what you need to do, the priests need to do, is to read during feast days and Easter, and during the absolving and life-giving sacrifice of the flesh and the blood of Christ. And every time when you read it, you need to pray for the salvation of God's soul. So this is kind of one story of a girl who was given into marriage, and during a childbirth she died. So this is a story that you will not normally find in any textbook, because it's kind of ordinary. There is nothing extraordinary about her. But this is a life of a person. It's a life of a person, and we could learn quite a lot of things about the difficult situation, about the marriage of these people, like the nobility primarily, and also the value of the manuscript that they had here, and how the manuscript could kind of substitute her and become a memorial for her. So this is the story of Gata. Now we'll move on a bit further east. We will go to Artsakh. So we will go to Khachen, this area that we call Artsakh. The Armenians at the time, it was called Artsakh and Khachen, the kingdom of Khachen. And I want to talk to you about Gandzasar. This is one of the most beautiful Armenian monasteries that we have. And this gorgeous monastery is unfortunately under Azeri control, and they're trying to rewrite the history, claiming that this has nothing to do with the Armenians. But what we know, there is a lot of evidence about this monastery. So historically, we know that the building of this monastery started in 1220. It lasted for 18 years, and then it was consecrated in 1240. I want you to pay attention to this building here. So this is what the Armenians call gavit. It's the English word is narthex, or you can call it vestibule. So it's a building which usually is built after the church, the original church. This is the original part of the church, and this was built about, well, if the church was built in 1240, it was they finished building this in 1261. So inside, you will find lots of inscriptions. And these inscriptions tell us the story of who built this monastery, who donated money, and so on, and anything related to the history. So if we read that particular bit, we find out that it was the year 710, according to the Armenian calendar, that is 1261. By the will of Almighty God, after the establishment of this church, I, Jalal Dola, son of Vakhtang, Lord of Artsakh, together with my spouse Mamkan, granddaughter of the king of Bakh, and my son Atabek Ivane, laid the foundation of this parsonage house and completed it with great labor. So this is kind of the passport of this monastery, saying who built it, when they did this, and who paid the money for this. And this is what the Azerbaijani narrative is. They say that the Armenians put this on the wall when they took it recently in the 1990s. But the fact is that we have this evidence from many other sources, and on top of this we also have a book from 1844 and book 1895. The same text is written there. So their claims that this was kind of done recently is nonsense. But they are trying to rewrite the the history. So here I want you to pay attention to this man. So Hassan Jalal Dola was a very prominent figure. He was the leader. His name doesn't sound Armenian, so he was the son of Vakhtang, but we know his ancestry. There is evidence that he comes from the family of Ivane and Zakarians. So they were very important military leaders in the Georgian army at the time, and so he's the grandson of Ivane and Zakarian's sister. So there is a close connection to it. And about the names, the Armenian names sounding a bit non-Armenian, I will speak at the very end. So this is the beautiful Gavit. So here is the entrance to the church. So this was the original entrance. And this is the western side of the monastery. So this very beautiful Gavit, it's quite big. You could see it's 11.8 meters to 13.25 meters. Quite a large and beautiful building. We have a historical source from the 13th century. Kyriakos Ganzaketsi tells us that the Gavit was built by Mamkan herself. And I want to point this out. This is quite important because this meant that it was her money only. So while in the first case it says that in the building of the church we had Hassan Jalal, his son and his wife, so all of them contributed to the building of the church. This particular part of the building was built by Mamkan herself, so using her own money. This meant that she had the financial independence and she could put her name on it. And this is not the only building that she sponsored. We have another building in Artsakh again. So this is the church of Surb Stepanos in a village called Vajar. And here there is a mausoleum. So it was believed that they brought some of the relics of Saint Stephen, and the family decided to bury it here. That's why the church is called Surb Stepanos, Saint Stepanos. And so this was a proper building, a proper mausoleum, which was again sponsored by Hassan Jalal's wife, by Mamkan herself. And we have an inscription that tells us more about this. And this time it is written in her name, in the first person. I, Queen Mamkan, spouse of Jalal Dola and granddaughter of the king of Bakh, that is of Sunik, built churches and donated my own land in Alchna as a gift. So this is another evidence that he had her own money and property and assets, and she could do whatever she wanted with it. So it wasn't like she got married and it belonged to her husband, something that you find in many other neighboring countries. In the Armenian case, they had this financial independence. And in the end, there is something quite typical here. It's quite mild, but maybe next semester I'll give a talk about the curses in the Armenian tradition. So here it says, whoever seizes my donation or disrupts the services shall be judged by God and the saints. So it's kind of a protective sort of message that you should not touch it. It was destroyed. We don't know exactly what happened. Most likely it was an earthquake or it could have been an attack, but we don't know exactly why it was in that condition. So this woman, and here it says churches. She built churches. So build can also mean renovate churches. And we find her name in other parts of Armenia as well. So she's originally from Artsakh, so she sponsored churches there. But we also find this church, which is close to where I was born. So this is in Zakhkador in Armenia. This is the Gecharis monastery. So it was built between 11th and 13th century. 13th century was the time when it was renovated. And in this renovation, on the wall of this monastery, we also find Mamkan's name. So she also contributed to the renovation of this church. So, and again, we hear about her in a colophon, which tells us a bit more about her role in the family and her position in the family. So when she died, her husband decided in her memory to sponsor a manuscript. And in the colophon, the following text was written. I, Hassan Jalal Dola, journeyed eastward to the king of archers and to the northern land with my own family, for the sake of the church's peace. So this is a period when Armenia was attacked by the Mongols, and they established their rule over not only Armenia but vast territories. And they were doing some changes in the structure of their empire. So he himself travels to the Mongol leader to try and negotiate better conditions for the Armenians. So instead of traveling on his own, he travels with his wife, Mamkan, and our God-given son, Atabak. We traveled to the northeast, and I continued onward to the ends of the earth, to the court of King Mongke Khan. So he was one of the biggest khans of the Mongol Empire. This is a bit unusual. Normally, we don't have women accompanying men for diplomatic missions, but in this case, it's interesting that she was involved. We don't know why and how, but most likely, this is my personal belief, she was quite influential, and she was definitely a very smart woman who could contribute, could help him in these negotiations. That's why he took her with him. And then we find out what happened to her. So when they were coming back, they stayed there approximately 5 years. The entire journey lasted for 5 years. On the way back, Hassan Jalal gets delayed in Tabriz, and at that time, when his wife and his son return home, Mamkan dies. And when he says, "I finally returned, I found my home filled with sorrow and inconsolable tears, for she was the comfort and consolation of all soldiers and cavalry, as well as of the church and clergy." So again, we have a woman who took care of all the charitable organizations, like helping the army, helping the church, and helping the clergy. That was kind of her role. So these were two very influential women, that their stories I told you. Now we'll go to slightly more, let's say, I wouldn't say obscure, but not very rich people who also contributed to making manuscripts. And we find some interesting stories about women's lives there. So this is a colophon that was written by a woman, well, in the name of a woman called Jahan Melik. And so the colophon starts, "May you remember the last purchase of this, Baron Shah, alongside his parents and all blood relatives." So this is written by Baron Shah himself. And then he says, "May you also remember my wife, Jahan Melik." And then it turns out that this manuscript was paid for by her money, not his money, along with her parents who, and so on. And then it says, so here, where is it? So they wanted this desirable manuscript, which is royal, because it came originally from the Cilician Armenian royal scriptorium. So the one that Jahan Melik, daughter of Lord Grigor, asked for and received it for her fairly earned assets, as she gave her Nishan, and I will explain these terms, 3,000 spitak, and her Yerestes, 3,000 spitak, and bought this in accordance with the command of the Savior, and so on. So she paid the money for this manuscript, and she paid 3,000 that came from her Nishan. So Nishan is the engagement money. So this kind of tells us that they would pay, at the time, we're talking about the 14th century, they would pay the bride's family some money during the engagement ceremony. Yerestes is another interesting tradition that lasted until very recently, so ethnographic sources are telling us. It's when you pay money to see the face of the bride, which meant that her face was covered normally, so they wouldn't see her. So they would come and pay the money to see whether she is beautiful or not. I mean, again, we're talking about a patriarchal society where women are bought, and but this kind of tells us, at least we learn about how this, what kind of traditions they followed. But once again, it's clear there is a reference here that these are her fairly earned assets. So the money that she received for this didn't go to her family or her husband's family, but they belonged to her. And so she could do with this money whatever she wanted. And in this particular case, she decided to buy this manuscript because it was very beautiful. It's kept in Matenadaran, so it has some very beautiful illuminations in it. So let's move on to another manuscript, another colophon. This comes from the 15th century, and it's again about a woman's story. This time the woman's name is Halim Khatun, and she had a very tragic life, really tragic life. So it starts by saying that a pitiable and humble woman, Halim Khatun, set her heart on this divine and holy gospel, which is the messenger of good news. Literally the translation of Evangelion, so the new, the messenger of good news. And she purchased this opulent treasure, this divinely worded holy gospel, in memory of herself and her child. And now we hear her story. The handsome and graceful young man Karapet, who departed joyfully to the city of Sultania, so that's in Iran today, and on his way back home, he was delivered into the hands of bloodthirsty, ruthless Tajiks. So Tajik was the word used for Muslims. They kind of didn't differentiate whether they were Turks or Kurds or Persians, so they just referred to them as Tajiks. Primarily, these were the Turkic-speaking people. So they martyred him for no reason with sword and dagger. So we find out her son was killed, and she decides to sponsor this manuscript in his memory. But the story doesn't finish there, unfortunately for her. Likewise, his brother, Hoja Hovanes, and Hoja, in medieval Armenian, it was a title of merchants. So this means that they come from a mercantile class. So his brother, the brother of the murdered Karapet, Hoja Hovanes, was also murdered by the sword, also at a young age, this time in Isfahan, at the hands of unrighteous bandits. That was enough. Another tragedy happens, as well as her other young son, Ezda Bakhshin, who also at a young age traveled to the east on business, and they returned with joy, and upon reaching Tabriz, he suffered the pain of death and departed to God. So she lost her 3 children who went most likely on a business. They went to the east and they never returned. And so the story continues that her husband, Grigor, and the father of these children, with broken heart and bitter life, went to Isfahan for his son Hovanes, and on his way back, with heavy sighs, disconsolately passed away in Sultania. So he didn't bear this trip. So this woman lost her husband, she lost her 3 children. And so then we have the continuation, the pitiable woman Halim Khatun, having witnessed this indescribable anguish, having spent days in tears and not having lost the light from God, purchased this holy gospel of the Lord in memory of herself and her parents Stepanos and Nazmelek, as well as of her husband Martyros. So if you remember before, her husband's name was Grigor. But apparently when Grigor died, she married again. This is also quite an interesting story, because we know that the church did not, at least frowned upon second marriage for women. Men could marry, they had more freedom in this respect, but women could not. So that's why the institute of widowhood was quite prominent. But in this case, we see that she had no issue. There is no other reference to, no condemnation or anything. That her other husband, so she dedicated it to her other husband Martyros and Grigor, and her living son Hovanes, and her brother Gorg, and daughter Gulpash, and all her blood relatives. So this is a tragic story, of course. In the end, we see that she kind of managed to fix her life. But again, it's a story of a woman about whom we learn only from this colophon. And this shows also not only the lifestyle of people at the time, how dangerous things were for many of them, but also this understanding how a manuscript that you sponsor can become a source of salvation for you. And I will end with 2 more examples related to women's education here. We don't know much about whether Armenian women, or we definitely know that Armenian women copied manuscripts. There are lots of manuscripts, especially starting from the 17th century onwards. In my other talk, I spoke about a scribe Mariam from the 15th century. We know definitely that there was a woman scribe who would copy manuscripts. But it turns out that we have also evidence of a woman copying manuscript earlier in the 13th century. And her name was Zabel. So, what do we know about her? So, unfortunately, none of her manuscripts survived. But we have the story that Revond Alishan presents, and usually he would rely on some other sources. Sometimes the Mekhitarist father would kind of use the manuscripts he had at his disposal. In this case, he tells the story of Zabel and another woman called Alit. So according to this description, and I really wanted to show this to you, that he speaks about Cilician Armenia, and here it says even women could write and read. Something perhaps surprising for the person who was originally writing this. And one of them was called Zabel. And Zabel adored the Maner Usmung. So that was the textbook of Armenian church music. And she was well versed in reading and the art of writing, and she willed to remain a virgin. So eventually she dedicated herself to God, but we know that at this time Armenians didn't have female monasteries. So we had male monasteries, but none for women. So most likely she just didn't marry and she stayed somewhere on her own. And the other one is a bit more funny. So this is about a girl whose name is Alit. And it says that likewise, during the same time, Cilician period, they say there was a virgin in Tarson with a name Alit, who was also a well-versed scribe. Again, 13th century. And then it says, she wrote down the alphabet, that is the Armenian alphabet, and said, who can write similar to this? He will be worthy of my attention. So kind of challenge. Most likely she had a calligraphic handwriting or something. So what happens, lots of people try to write in the same way, and so we find out that two individuals copied and brought it to her. Having not liked it, she said, the top edge of Z, the letter Z, and the circle of Z looks nothing like the letters of Alit. So, yeah, it wasn't a good job. And she said again to her suitors, whoever writes the top edge of Z, the circle of Z, he will become the groom of Alit. This is written in poetic form. I try to translate it in poetic form, but it's difficult. So, but there is rhyming in it. And then one of them put it to writing, and having liked it, she said, the top edge of Z and the circle of Z looks just like the letters of Alit. So she kind of approved, I guess, of that person. Now, this is not much, of course, but we know a lot more. We can learn a lot more about women. There are lots of sources like this, short stories, and we need to read each story on its own. And this is my kind of personal belief that every woman deserves, every person deserves, but especially women, because they were constantly erased from these narratives. So they deserve to, for them to be represented on the pages of books, and so that we talk about them. Now, I mentioned that when I was reading these names, I was struck by the fact that we have some names which are definitely not Armenian. I mean, Melek said Gata, Jahan Melik, Khalim Khatun. It wasn't that I specifically picked those people. All of them were like from the medieval period, all the names were like this. Very rarely would you find a name like Gayane or Ripsime. So this was kind of not a common name. So more or less you find this type of names in the colophons and in the manuscripts. Now, the prominent Armenian linguist, Zakarian, was also puzzled by that, and he said, I don't know. I don't have an answer to this as well, but I studied a little bit some recent phenomenon. And also when I watched this film about Fresno Armenians, it kind of confirmed my understanding that most likely this is what happens. It's a coping mechanism. when you find yourself under foreign rule, under foreign control, you try somehow to cope with that situation. And you try to adapt your names to the surroundings so that it doesn't sound a bit weird, but also at the same time, especially if there is a centralized power, in order, and this applies also to men, in order to find some sort of progression in your career, you also try to adapt the names that are familiar to people living there. So this could be the case, but I'm afraid I don't know for sure what was happening. And when this started is, we know that from the ancient times, Armenians used to have Persian names, Parthian names. If you think about the names that we believe are Armenian, most of them are not. They come again from Zoroastrian, for example, gods, like the names like Vahak, Miran, and so on. So, yeah, you will find lots of women's names from the medieval period having this, and this is another kind of topic for study. And to conclude, so what I was trying to do today is I wanted to show you a little bit, a glimpse, as I said. There are thousands of stories like this about different women living in different places and contributing to their communities, to their families, doing things, having their own agency. The problem is that all these stories are written by men, most of these stories. So very few that we find much later are written by women themselves. And even if they are written by women, we're talking about the patriarchal society that again imposes these restrictions. You can't write anything you want in those cases. But we clearly see that if we try to read beyond this imposed narratives, we can see that they had agency, that they wanted to build a church, they built the church. We know many churches, like you've heard about famous churches like Sanahin and Hakhpat. We have the wife of the Armenian Lord was funding those churches as well. We have many other buildings that were built and sponsored by women. So in that sense, they had the agency, they could decide for themselves what to do. The second thing is that they could do all of this because they had their own money. So when they married, and I found out this already in the 5th century, we have evidence for this, that women, whenever they married, they kept their assets, whatever they brought from their parents' house, they would have it. And there is even a reference to this. If they got divorced, they could take everything they brought with them. So that was their own money, and they could do whatever they wanted with it. So that's also, it matters. If you are financially independent, that matters a lot. You can do lots of things. And also women had education. As I said, we know this already from the 5th century, the fact that women supported their children with education. They were in charge of negotiating and supervising how the clergy would teach their children, so they themselves would receive education. They knew how to read and write, and one thing is for sure, that when they start already copying manuscripts and the other evidence that in Cilicia and Armenia many women could do this, that already proves us that there was no taboo imposed on them, so they could definitely do this. And finally, there are many, many untold stories of women. And I think these stories should be told. These stories should go into our history books, that we learn more about what women did. I think I was just thinking about this the other day when I was preparing for this talk. So as a boy, I grew up, I heard about Vartan Mamikonian and how he sacrificed himself. And it's a kind of figure that I can identify with as a little boy, and I can try to be like him if they try to encourage them and to develop this patriotic sense of identity. But what about women? What about the little girls who go to the same school? What kind of ideals and what kind of female figures they have, so that they can resemble them? And this is why the stories of Zabel Yesayan, Diana Abgar, the first Armenian woman diplomat, and many, many other women who contributed to preservation of Armenian culture and Armenian identity. I think these women should come forward. We should talk about them. We should give voice to them so they appear in our textbooks. We can't write history, complete history, without having women in that history. Thank you.